Hello, my name is Dave Risick. I work for a company called BMT, and together with a bunch of colleagues from BMT and with Atlas Urban, we're doing this work on risk-based urban studies and strategies for growth for Lenakel on Tanna Island in Vanuatu. So I'll just talk to you briefly about the climate risk work, and there will be another video from our town planning colleague Paul, who will talk to you more about the town strategy work that we've done. So firstly, we want to think about why we need an urban study and strategy for Lenakel. Well, when you don't have a strategy, development tends to be ad hoc and all over the place, and potentially in the wrong sort of places that we want to develop based on the sort of events that can happen in the area, such as cyclones, etc. And importantly, with the advent of climate change, we really start to need to understand what that means to the future of a town such as Lenakel, and where we can actually start to develop it appropriately and make plans for the future to live in a climate effective world, but safely and with great potential for growth. And that's the focus of this project. So we're looking at a number of different hazards for this project. Those include cyclones and wind, which people are very familiar with, but also storm surge and inundation associated with cyclones. Importantly, for an island such as Tanna, earthquakes and volcano are other risks that we need to take into account. Tsunamis are an issue, as is landslides, where we have lots of rain and very steep slopes. And of course, with a lot of rain, we also need to consider the risks associated with flooding. Risk is defined by looking at what the consequence of an event might be, but also the likelihood of that event occurring. So based on those two factors, you then can calculate the risk that's associated with that. So if we have a big impact from a particular hazard, such as a tsunami, there might be a higher risk, but we always need to recognize that the likelihood of this occurring is pretty low. Some other things, such as flooding, are more likely to occur more regularly, but they might not have as big consequences for the community, and therefore the risk also gets calculated in a different way. And I guess just in terms of looking at risk-based land use planning, we can often think about what developments are in a particular area of hazard. So if you look at the two figures on the left, there's the same sort of likelihoods of something occurring, but in the picture above, there's houses and buildings, and they have a much bigger impact on the community if they get damaged or lost. And so there might be a higher risk associated with that, as opposed to something below where we have assets that can be replaced or which don't affect people's lives as much. And so understanding those values and consequences is really important for the sort of work that we do. So we've looked at a variety of different hazards for the area. We've tried to obtain the best available information that we could. We didn't collect any new data, but we've used that to try and work out what the likelihoods are, in other words, associated with the return periods of certain events. How likely are they to occur? And we've used that information to really start to understand how that affects the Lenakel area as it stands today. So we've got information on storm surge inundation. I'm not going to show you all the mapping that we have that's available in reports, but you can see on the figure on the right, there are blue lines, and those show the depth and the extent of where you might get storm surge inundation happening. And the yellow blocks are developments on the land. And obviously, if those developments are not covered by a particular surge at a particular time, then they're likely to be safe from that particular hazard. And we've done that looking at the variety of hazards that I mentioned earlier. So going into a little bit more detail on storm surge, that's the Lenakel Wharf that you can see in yellow in the blue zone, and something that one would need to be cautious about into the future. We've also looked at flooding, different levels of likelihood of this occurring, both at present and into the future, and also looking at when these floodings occur, how deep the water gets and how fast the water runs. and that enables us to start to think about what that means to those developments or agriculture or any activities that take place near to those floodwaters. Now, importantly, from a town planning perspective, and you'll hear more from Paul, is to think about when we look at these all together, not individually, because if we make a really good decision to avoid flooding, we might put that in the way of wind damage from a cyclone or landslide damage on a steeper slope, which we don't want to. So we put all the information together and we're able to start getting a picture. And over here you can see the blue is flooding, the brown is landslip areas, and the white is where there's not many hazards. And so you can start to understand where you may appropriately put development into the future where there is a lower risk. We can't say that there's no risk, but we can say there's a much lower risk to the assets and the people that live there. And that's something we want to aim at through this study. Now, based on all this, our town planners have started to use that information to look at opportunity precincts where they can start that discussion with the landowners and with the community and with government to think about which are the most appropriate places to develop that suit the needs of the community. And Paul, as I said, will talk about this more in a moment. The other thing that we were able to do from the work that we've done to date is start to think about what some of those responses might be over time to those cyclones. So not only thinking of it from a planning perspective, but also thinking about what is the nature of these events when they occur, what sort of responses might be, and what you might need to do in addition to planning controls down the line. So that might be, for example, just one overview of cyclones. There's a medium likelihood of cyclones occurring in the Tanna or Lenakel area of Tanna. But when it does occur, and when you do get those winds, the storm surge, the intense rain, there's quite a large impact, and it impacts a fairly large area of the town, which means that there needs to be good evacuation routes, useful evacuation centers outside of those risk areas. We need to get information out to people early, and it really is an emergency management response. And we also note that the recovery after one of these sorts of events can take some time, as we already know from previous events that have occurred. So yes, it's really important to put in planning controls, make sure that there's no critical infrastructure in those low-lying areas. That includes the telecom infrastructure, hospitals, schools, evacuation centers. Really critical that they're outside of potential risk areas. We need to design some of the infrastructure that we can't necessarily put outside these areas strongly to ensure that they're able to cope with that sort of pressure. So that includes ports, airports, and roads. So they can withstand those impacts. Obviously, for the people who live in the community, we'd like to hope that they were out of the way of the storm surge events, and often they aren't, but houses everywhere need to be built to withstand stronger winds so that they don't lose their roofs or don't get further damage when these events occur. And of course, we can start in the long term to think about other adaptation options that we might put into place that can reduce some of the impacts on land. So that might be ecosystem-based adaptation responses, such as planting mangroves, planting other coastal vegetation to strengthen the coast and reduce the impact of winds and storm surge. So that's just an example, and I won't go to any more of those, but we have touched on those in the more detailed reports. So I'll thank you for your time, and you will see another video from Paul talking about the town planning elements. Thank you.